So on the topic of the irrigated pasture here at the beginning, we do have some forage choices specifically whether we're going to be using cool season or the warm season. That would be our primary, our two primary categories. And then within the cool seasons or warm seasons, of course, we have annuals or perennials that we might be considering to plant or have use for. And of course, just a quick background again on what the difference is between a cool and a warm season plant. The cool seasons kind of illustrated here in the blue line, of course, begin their growth fairly early in the spring, late March to mostly April. And then they have very rapid growth during the month of May and June. And then during the heat of the summer, they really slow down. But in the fall period, they will increase their growth somewhat again, as long as there is some moisture available. So, of course, smooth brome is probably our most common grass in Nebraska, and that would be a cool season. And then the black line illustrates what the growth pattern is for a warm season plant. They begin their growth in early to mid-May, and then just have that one shot where they have their most rapid growth in late June and July. And then by the end of the summer, end of August, early September, they have been pretty well or have completed their growth for that season. So if we think about some of the differences in terms of the planting cool versus warm season perennial grasses, of course, if we are able to irrigate this, of course, I think the cool seasons definitely have the advantage in terms of the reasons being they do have that longer growing period, basically from April through October. Another really key thing is that they are fairly quick to establish compared to a warm season grass, say like big blue stem or switchgrass. Those warm seasons, they really need almost an entire year for their establishment to get well started. Another thing with the cool seasons related to irrigation, of course, is that they do respond very well to the water or fertilizer that we might apply. And of course, too, if you think again about smooth brome, they're very persistent to grazing and just very tough grasses. So when it comes to the cool season perennials, in terms of what we might use in a mixture, we've got an old standby here where orchardgrass, meadow brome, smooth brome grass, and creeping foxtail are four species that work well together in a mix. And then alfalfa or some other legume can certainly be optional. And usually in most cases, if we think about where fertilizer prices are now, that having a legume in there certainly can have its benefits, both in terms of being able to fix some nitrogen for the grasses, as well as just the overall quality of the forage. There are some other species out there as well that could be included in these mixes. Here are some different intermediate and pubescent wheatgrasses. There's also some fescues and festuloniums that we've seen included in some of these mixes. And again, some people ask whether or not they should just use a single species, say of orchardgrass versus a mixture. And we always encourage that there's many benefits to having a mixture of several species in a pasture mix. And a lot of the reasons, or some of the reasons for this, include that in most fields, we may have some variability in the soils across that field. Again, even though these all may be cool season species, they do have some differences in their growth pattern across the season. Some, for example, like a tall fescue or festulonium, they tend to do a little bit better than in the heat of the summer, for example, compared to something like smooth brome. Then likewise, there's some differences in resistance to diseases or winter hardiness and so forth. One real important characteristic I think that we do need to consider if we're specifically thinking about pasture is that whether or not they're a sod forming grass versus a bunchgrass. So on the left in this photo is some Orchardgrass, and it's a 3-year-old stand, and you can certainly still see the drill rows where that was planted. So Orchardgrass, a bunchgrass, tends to remain in that bunch. On the right is creeping foxtail. Smooth brome grass would also be another example of a sod forming grass. So it does fill in empty spaces between the rows, or if certain other plants happen to die out. Again, I mentioned legumes. That certainly could be part of the mix, and I've got some alfalfa, red clover, ladino, clover or white clover, birchwood trefoil, or Sisler milkvetch listed here as possibilities. And of these, of course, alfalfa is probably by far the most productive and easiest to establish of these. And some people, of course, would have concerns about bloat with alfalfa, but if we are just considering to add a small amount in the mix, say 1 to 2 pounds of seed per acre, we're going to have some alfalfa out there in the forage, but not enough to the point where we'd have any concerns about bloat. Here's an example mix that we have put together. It has 6 different species in there, plus some alfalfa. I did look up what the seed cost was this year, not for the individual species, but excuse me, but for this particular mix, looking at about $90 to $110 per acre seed cost this year. So that's up considerably from a couple of years ago, but everything is going up in price these days, of course. So that's where it's at, about $90 to $110. But you do have to keep in mind that this is a perennial grass seed mixture, and you know, we do anticipate 8 to 15 years even of life expectancy from this stand of grass if we do everything right and then get it established well. So some planting guidelines related to the cool season grasses can either be seeded in the spring or late summer. The spring seeding, we're looking at, you know, the late March to early April time frame. As cool seasons, with the spring seeding, you will have some production that first year. Typically by the middle of July, you may be able to, should be well established enough to begin some grazing, or it could be hayed at that time as well. Late summer seeding, August 10th to September 10th is kind of the window I have there. And with that late summer seeding, one advantage you have is you're going to have a lot fewer weed problems compared to if you were to do spring seeding. And with that late summer seeding, your objective is to get that grass germinated and begin its growth, so that by the time you get to late October or the 1st of November, you're anywhere from 5 to 6 inches tall, and it's ready to overwinter. And then the following spring, it'll really take off. And that following spring, certainly by May, you would be able to do some or begin some grazing on it, or haying during the latter part of the month. Some common approaches to those late summer seedings might be, here was an example of some corn that was silaged off, and then the grass is seeded. It was disked, and then the grass is seeded right into that. Here's another example where there was some foxtail millet that was hayed off in August, and then the cool season grasses drilled into that foxtail millet stubble. Little few things on fertilizer, which of course, again, for everybody this year that does any type of farming, a lot of concern about the high fertilizer prices, including nitrogen. And one of the things with the cool season grasses, you know, they have found that they do respond well to nitrogen fertilizer, even yield responses up to 200 pounds per acre. That would be pretty expensive, and in most cases, you know, producers aren't going to be applying that much, but we do see some information showing here that in an old trial on some orchard grass and smooth grass, smooth brome grass, kind of basically the response curve to nitrogen fertilizer. And you see that at about 150 pounds, you're pretty well maxing out the amount of the response to the fertilizer with that. But, even at lesser amounts of fertilizer, you do get quite a yield increase. And so again, the economics associated with that fertilizer kind of has to relate to how much forage you need and those types of things as well. And you do have to remember that under grazing, that we do have considerable nutrient cycling going on with the urine and manure that those cattle are depositing. And some of the things I've noticed or heard and seen from producers is that if they had a field that, say, had been in corn or soybeans previous years and they converted it to irrigated grass and were grazing it, yeah, those fertilizer needs were pretty noticeable or significant those first few years. But over time, you'll see quite a change in the soil under these perennial grasses compared to being annually cropped to corn or soybeans, whatever, and actually see some decline in nutrient needs for that irrigated grass the longer it is in irrigated grass, and the productivity remains quite good. A few things on irrigation. To be fully irrigated, these cool season grasses do like a lot of water. If we think about our different crops, alfalfa by far in terms of what it can take or the maximum amounts of water and irrigation response you can get from it. Alfalfa by far is the #1 crop as far as needing a lot of water. But the cool season grasses, yeah, they're not quite like alfalfa, but they are fairly close. This is just an example here from central Nebraska, where on the blue bars, the blue bars shows the average monthly precipitation from April through October, and the orange bars represent what cool season grasses would need to be fully irrigated. And so really basically the difference between the blue and orange bar would be the amount of water that would need to be applied if needed, if it wasn't raining, to really maintain a fully irrigated stand of grass. And as you would expect, once you get into the summer months, like July and August, precipitation is relatively good at that time, but the water needs can be quite high. And related to irrigation, we have looked at when it is most efficient for the cool season grasses. And as you would expect, as shown in this chart here, in that spring period through, I've got here May 22nd is where we sampled, but for every inch of water, whether it's irrigation or rainfall, we're producing about 665 pounds of dry matter forage per inch of water. And so in the spring of the year, as a cool season grass, we're dealing with the optimum temperature and sunlight day length for those cool season grasses. So they use that water very efficiently, versus say here in midsummer and August, where our irrigation is still growing some grass, but the efficiency isn't there, where we're at just 257 pounds of dry matter forage for every inch of water. And another really important thing too, when it comes to that irrigation, we do not necessarily have to be, fully irrigating it to get, a very productive stand of grass. I have some different limited irrigation scenarios here. And for example, going to the one that's limited #2, and blue would indicate, so April, May, and June, we would certainly be irrigating then as needed, but we may stop irrigation in July and the early part of August during the heat of the summer, Our cool season grasses won't be growing as much as that time at that time, but even without that irrigation, they're not going to be dying. They'll just won't be producing as much. And then we might again irrigate some in late August and September for fall growth. And in that scenario, for example, we may only need to use 7 inches of water, but that doesn't mean we're going to receive or get half the yield of a fully irrigated, say 14-inch, but we still probably would get 80% or so of the yield of a fully irrigated type of strategy. A few things on grazing, and I think grazing on this is really important. As you're seeing, we are putting quite a few inputs into this irrigated pasture, both in all in terms of the fertilizer, irrigation, seed, and so on. But we really need to do a good job with our grazing management in order to get the most out of the grass that we're producing. And this here kind of gives some general range of carrying capacity or stocking rates that we might expect to see on a good stand of irrigated grass. And over the years, and in visiting with a number of people that I've worked with on this, a pretty typical stocking rate has been about a pair or pair and a quarter, so 1 1/4 cow-calf pairs per acre for a 5 to 6 month season. And that's the equivalent of about 8 or so animal unit months per acre if you look at the stocking or carrying capacity in that form. So it can be quite productive compared to some of our native pasture. For example, in the Sandhills range, we have stocking rates of maybe only 0.6 to 0.8 AUMs per acre. Some smooth brome grass in eastern Nebraska, you may be able to have a stocking rate of 2 AUMs per acre. So this can be significantly higher and more productive than some of the non-irrigated types of pasture. And then also with that grazing, we do suggest again at least some type of rotational grazing where we may have at least 5 or 6 paddocks that we rotate through. Early on in the spring, for example, when we begin the grazing on some irrigated grass, we might have, say, if we had 5 paddocks, we would have spend about a week, 5 to 7 days in each paddock, and then rotate through that series of 5 paddocks. And then so after we completed all 5 paddocks, we'd have a time lapse of about 5 weeks, 4 to 5 weeks. And then we would begin the second cycle of grazing through those paddocks again. So this practice kind of manages to put you on a harvest sequence that can almost be somewhat similar to haying. Keeps those grasses vegetative and hopefully not letting them get too far advanced in maturity. The other key thing, I think, with our grazing, and then we've seen, is that we do want to maintain some residual leaf area there. So in other words, when those grasses get down to an average stubble height, we call it, of about 5 or so inches, that should really be our key indicator in that it's time to move to the next paddock. Because we've seen with some of our different types of studies that if you do graze shorter than that, what the result is going to be, it's just going to have a longer period for it to recover, and it's going to hurt your overall yield. So maintaining that 5-inch height is after grazing is a key point to be. Something else that's related to grazing that can be a little bit difficult to manage is just the general growth rate or growth periods of those cool season grasses. So this is somewhat similar to a cool season grass curve, but this just illustrates that where we sampled in the month of May, for example, we were producing or growing about over 120 to 130 pounds of forage per day, pounds per acre per forage per day. So that growth rate during the month of May is very rapid. I mean, if you look at it in inches, that's certainly at least an inch to an inch and a half of growth per day during that month of May. And then, of course, as we get into the heat of summer, we're going to have that slowdown where grass is still growing, but it's not growing anywhere as fast as we saw early on in the during that month of May. So where this becomes challenging is when we are grazing that. So typically during that month of May, sometimes we may feel that the grass is getting away from us. You know, in other words, we don't have enough cattle out there. And then during the mid part of the summer, when the grass is slowed down, we may be getting ahead of that grass. So having the ability to be flexible in those animal numbers or adjust those animal numbers to match the growth of the grass is certainly an advantage when it comes to grazing effectively some of these cool season pastures, irrigated pastures. There's a few different strategies out there related to how this irrigated pivot of grass can be used. So, you know, season-long pairs beginning from about mid-April, and mid-April would be a pretty good average turnout date for the cool season grasses or starting point. Some cases here, I've worked with producers that use their irrigated grass with pairs only in the spring or maybe calve in April and pair out onto that irrigated grass. But by 1st of June or so, they would move those pairs to native pasture, dryland range, or other pasture, and then bring in some yearlings to graze that irrigated grass. A third one shown there is using pairs spring and early summer, then have a no use period in late summer where you're stockpiling that grass, and then maybe bring some weaned calves onto it in the fall. And so that third one would be very similar to a practice, say in the sandhills, where people that have sub-irrigated meadow and they hay it, they do that haying in early July, and then the regrowth after the haying of that meadow is used in the fall of the year with, say, some weaned calves. Just a couple more different potential strategies or uses and how the irrigated grass can be used are shown here. I'll just talk a little bit about some of the different annual forages. And again, this is probably more so, doesn't necessarily have to be irrigated. And with these annual forages, I kind of like to break it up by the different time of year where they might be planted, and then of course how they're subsequently used after planting. So we can think about our winter annuals, of course, things like the winter wheat, rye, triticale, barley. There's some annual ryegrasses also that can overwinter, but of course fall planted. You know, and in terms of forages, probably rye is probably one of the more common species or cereal grains that is used as forage in the fall planting. Whoops. Let me back up if I can. There we go. We have done some work here at North Platte with looking at a lot of different triticale varieties too, in terms of just what they can produce. And some of the triticales, which is a wheat and rye hybrid, can be very productive, and we've seen some really good yields from them. In this case, we're looking at some forage or hay, but can be silage as well too. But if we look at seed costs of all of these winter annuals, rye is likely the least expensive, and still can have very considerable productivity from just common rye. The other annual planting time period would be in the spring. And here we're looking at some other primarily small cereal grains such as oats, spring triticale, spring barley, field peas. There's a few other cool season type legumes that could be included as well. In Nebraska, oats is probably one of the more common cool season annuals that we see planted for forage, whether it be hay or grazing. Oat seed is again, just like everything else, is up this year, pretty expensive. We have done work too, comparing some of the different spring seeded ones, and we have seen that there are spring triticales and spring barleys that can be equally as productive as oats and just have the same nutritional quality. So if you are thinking on some spring planted annuals this year, you might check around on seed prices of these different species in terms of where you might get the best deal. So yeah, with those spring planted cool seasons like the oats and barley and so on, mid-March to mid-April, they tolerate the cool temperatures and germinate in the cool temperatures pretty well. In general, yeah, depending on the species, those seeding rates might vary a little bit. For fertilization, again, nitrogen is the primary thing. We have done some work, and I've seen that to get, say, it's oats, for example, that you're using, and you may not have much nitrogen left in the soil. 50 to 75 pounds of nitrogen per acre, you will see a pretty nice response to that, and certainly really increase your yields. Here's just an example of some the different species that we had here in a late March planting date. And just to give you an idea of some of the hay yields, so this would be hay yield that we saw on dry matter basis, with some different varieties of oats and barley and triticale, but anywhere from to 3.5 to over 4.5 tons of hay per acre. So pretty respectable yields for some of these different spring seeded cereal grains. A little bit about our warm season summer annuals. So we're talking late spring or summer seeded, that'd be the millets, and a whole variety of forage sorghums and sorghum sudan grass hybrids or straight sudan grass. These are typically, of course, planted after we've got those warmer soil temperatures, usually about mid to late May, when we'll see 60-degree soil temperatures, which is really necessary for them for good germination of those warm season annuals. And we have seen that certainly, depending on the situation or need, with a warm season annual, you could go even as late as the 1st of August on a planting date and still get some pretty respectable yields from that, which, you know, people might consider a pretty late planting date. Sometimes these annual forages in general kind of get a bad rap related to nitrates, particularly the summer annual ones, the sorghums and pearl millet and so on. And that is true to some extent. I've got, after these different types or groups of plants, I've got a relative ranking related to their potential to accumulate nitrates. And so you do see for the sorghums, all these sudan grass and sorghum sudan grass hybrids, that it is relatively high potential. But even if we're dealing with a spring seeded small grain cereal, you know, those can accumulate nitrates as well. Some of those other species that we may have in a cover crop mixture, like those shown here, the beets or turnips and radishes and so on, they have, we consider more of a medium potential for some nitrate accumulation. Weeds, of course, here, oftentimes considered, again, you know, like a potentially higher risk, things like the pigweeds, lamb's quarters, and so on, as you see down that list. Even legumes, if we think about it and looked into that close enough, it's low, but there certainly is a little bit of nitrate potential with them as well. Just so on that topic of nitrates in our forages, whether we're grazing or haying this, we think about why and what causes them. Certainly the weather plays a big role, and it's usually a stressor. So drought stress is probably the most common, but things like frost, hail, low temperatures, shading, those can trigger a case in a lot of these plants where we have accumulation of nitrates. And then, of course, with that, excess nitrogen in the soil. So, maybe fertilizer or manure. In some cases, for example, I've seen it with, we may have had a cornfield that was hailed out in July and totally hailed out. And so the producer came in after that corn was hailed out and planted a sorghum Sudan grass hybrid, but that corn had already its full application of nitrogen for the year, but it was much more than that sorghum Sudan grass needed. And as a result, so even under irrigation, that sorghum Sudan grass had some high nitrates. Manure in another case, I've worked with some people that, as an example, had maybe it was an older backgrounding lot, kept a lot of calves in there for years and years and years over the winter. And then they were going to farm that 5 to 10 acre backgrounding lot, and it had quite an accumulation of manure in it from a lot of years of being a backgrounding lot. And so all that manure in the soil resulted in some high levels of nitrates on whatever type of forage they tried to grow on that old backgrounding lot. In some cases too, herbicides, again, if we're particularly thinking about weeds that had been sprayed, would be a stress to that weed plant and can result in some higher levels of nitrates. And when you do a nitrate test on a forage sample, whether it's from a hay sample or you actually went out and collected some that you had planned to graze, be careful in terms of how you interpret the results. Most labs, there's 3 different ways where labs will report nitrates, and nitrate nitrogen is the most common. And they will give you a parts per million or a % of what the toxic level would be. And that's usually, of course, stated on the results of the sample that you sent in, and they'll tell you whether it's safe, toxic, moderately toxic, or highly toxic. One of the key things with nitrates, and this is using corn as example here, some drought stress corn, dryland corn, but we took some of those corn plants and separated them by plant part and had them analyzed for nitrates. Okay, so in the case of that corn, the leaf and husk had very low nitrates, and the red line here is just the boundary, I guess, if you will, for the potential toxic amount. But what you see in again in this corn plant example, the lower parts of the stems, the 0 to 6, 6 to 12, and even the 12 to 18 had the highest levels of nitrates. And then once you got up to the upper parts of that corn plant, even though it was drought stress, it was quite safe. And the other key thing here too, this was done both in August and in October. And one of the things about nitrates, they're very slow to dissipate or disappear out of that plant after it's finished its growing for that season. So those nitrates do hang on into that affected plant. So this is for corn, but the same principle applies to, say, a sorghum Sudan grass, where the lower parts of that stem are going to have the higher concentrations of nutrients, of nitrates, excuse me. One other category of annual forages that we see used quite a bit is doing some planting in the late summer or summer itself. And here our objective is to be looking at fall or winter forage. And with those late summer planting dates, again, some of those species we use in the spring work quite well, like the oats, barley, and so on. Here we consider like a planting date of late July through August. And then, of course, the winter annuals, which we plant in late August or September. You may get some fall winter forage, but mostly it's the following spring that we're anticipating a lot of use from them. This again, just being an example of some late summer. It's August 13th, planted different small grains, and then harvested on October 29th, and showing some of the hay tonnage that we received from those, anywhere from 3 to, again, almost 4.5 tons of hay yield per acre, which is quite respectable. Similarly with the small grains, you do see a lot of people, of course, using some of the different forage cocktails or cover crop types of species in mixes in for that late summer planting or early fall planting in hopes of having some fall forage. This year, just an example of a mixture put in after wheat harvest. So late July, I believe, was a planting date. And then this is some of the early fall growth in terms of what it looks like. Again, that if we are thinking about that late summer period for fall forage or winter forage, that planting date is really critical. And this photo here just gives an example of on the foreground here, this would be some different small grains planted on August 13th, and the photo was taken October 8th. But here's a much later planting, September 21st, and you can see how not much growth has occurred, and so we very likely have very little, if any, usable fall forage. So the window we like to use in terms of a cool season annual, September 1st, basically the deadline or rule of thumb, if we want to have any amount, a significant amount of forage for the fall. For those warm season annuals, again, like I said earlier, we've gone as late as early August with some planting of those, and have found to receive or gotten a pretty significant amount of growth during that month of August and early September on those. If we do have irrigation and using some annuals, there's some different double cropping scenarios we can think about to really maximize the use of that ground that we might be farming with these, and kind of have a multiple crops, or maybe if we are grazing, a more continuous period of potential grazing. So, again, example here showing a cool season spring planted one. Say it could be oats as an example. It's going to be that late May and June where we've got a lot of growth and forage out there. A warm season annual planted in late May. It's July and August would be the time period. But then, we could go with a late summer planting of a cool season annual again, and be specifically looking for some September, October abundance or rapid growth of forage at that time. And you can put together different types of scenarios or fields, if you will, where, again, especially in the case if you're grazing, using some of these different cool and warm seasons, that you could have a more continuous supply, I guess, of grazing. So in the example here, one field may have had something like oats planted in the spring, the cool season. That can be grazed in late May and June and a bit into early July. After that oats is grazed out, late July to early August, you could plant some cool season again. It could be oats or any of those small grain cereals for the fall grazing period. In another field, you could have planted some warm season annual sorghum Sudan grass hybrid, for example, in late May. That would be ready for grazing beginning in the earlier part of July. But what you see here, if we were thinking about a continuous stream of grazing, so after that oats was grazed out, you could move to this warm season annual, which would be ready to graze beginning there in July. So a few different possibilities that can be worked out with multiple fields and using both cool and warm season annuals. I think, yes, that is what I had in terms of the presentation for this morning. And certainly I think we do have time for questions, correct, Brandy? I did see in the chat, I can certainly, yes, email you a PDF copy of these slides, and that way you could have them kind of as a reference, and plus my contact information as well if you do have more questions specifically for me.
Okay, no questions? Quiet group. Okay, I think they're just taking it all in.
Good.
Jerry.
Okay.
So thank you very, very much for presenting, and yeah, have a great day.
Okay, sounds good. And I'll get that sent to you so you can distribute it to the participants today. And again, like I said, if questions come up later, feel free to contact me, and I'll be happy to visit with you more about this.
Okay, wonderful. Thanks, Jerry.
You bet.